We might make a start. I think we had about 50 people register, and we've got probably half to 2/3 of that, which is normal. So others can come in as they want to. So welcome to the June Retrofit Forum. We've got a great topic today, one really pertinent to the university and something I'm personally very interested in as well. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on, the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people. So I'd just like to pay our respects to them, to their elders past, present and emerging, and just say that these proceedings take place in the spirit of reconciliation. I'm going to talk about the challenges and opportunities of retrofitting mid-century buildings, of which there's more than just a few around the university and the city. I've worked on a few of these really big challenges around things like floor heights and vertical transportation and regulations and documentation also. So hopefully we'll hear a lot of that today. We've got our normal format, which is a 15 to 20 minute presentation from academia and then industry. So Kirsten Day from Architecture, Building and Planning is going to talk about some recent work that she's done with Niluka Gareth from Infrastructure, Department of Infrastructure Engineering, looking at the changes in regulations and the challenges that causes for buildings, along with some other things that make retrofit difficult, like trying to find existing documentation and knowing what's actually in these buildings. That's on the basis of a paper and some work they did around the John Medley Building, which is really timely because it's a building that's slated to be demolished as a part of the Melbourne University master plan. It's an old Roy Grounds building. It's got some, it's been in the news recently with Philip Goad, interviewed by the Age, talking about its heritage value and other things. And there's a lot of discussion around the university on the merits of keeping it or demolishing it and starting again. The last I saw was this afternoon an Instagram post with someone putting up an image of old medieval castles with the low turrets and the bridges in between. So there's some interesting genealogy there in terms of architecture. And so I imagine that presentation is going to leave us with a lot of questions, which is why we have Hannah Kuek from Ashton Raggett McDermott along to talk about a project that they have just finished. I think the Baillieu Library at Melbourne University. Just
under construction at the moment.
Under construction. Yeah. Finished the documentation and following through. So that's down the Professor's Walk. It's I love that building. I walk past it. I really like old 60s facades, and that's got a great one. And they've just dealt with all of those same issues and imagine documentation. I know floor-to-floor heights and other things and access to light. So hopefully we'll hear what some of the answers are anyway in being able to retrofit some of these buildings. I'll close with what's going on around the traps in retrofit. And yeah, I guess with that we might start off with Kirsten and Niluka. Are you guys able to take control of the? I'll stop sharing here. Kirsten.
What's interesting is this morning I did a tour around the campus, and while we were looking specifically at queer heritage, it was really interesting to have a look at all of our different buildings and the history of our buildings. And they were talking about a lot of the events that were happening at the Union Building and how that is also slated for demolition as well. And so, you know, there's part of it where, I mean, initially where the project that Niluka and our team have been working on was really to have a look at how we might look at non-destructive testing to really sort of say, well, you know, we've got a building that does, you know, it's got so many years of life into it. And so if we can do this testing, we can say, well, you know, this is a candidate for retrofit. Like all good intentions, we sort of, as we sort of opened what seemed to be a very simple idea, ended up being something far more complicated than that. But in that, and particularly with this campus, and I imagine most university campuses are like this, there's a whole history that also goes with that as well. The social history, the things that have made Melbourne University what it is, or and the buildings that we're looking at are of a very similar era to what's happening at La Trobe. And so, you know, it's this interesting value that we place on what architecture is and what the buildings are. And so, I mean, while we might sort of look at an ultimate sort of timeline about, you know, we need to be looking at embodied carbon and all of those elements, which are fundamentally important about how we look at buildings. It's also, there is a sort of a social history that goes with those as well. And so, but part of what we were looking at was, well, how can we say, you know, this needs to be kept and that doesn't? And so, what was amazing with the project that we had seed funding between architecture and engineering. And so we could look at it from this cross-disciplinary perspective. And so we had some amazing papers, and Ali was great with leading his project, and Xiao with the paper that Paolo presented at ARCOM. And it was a really interesting way of looking at these projects. So our case study was the John Medley Building, but it also, we had initially started looking at the housing towers, but we thought it was probably easier to have a look at our own campus because we will have so much information, apparently. We go to the next slide. So, so my background is in architecture, and so I'm going to talk to the first couple of slides about this particular project. So it's been slated for demolition under the Estate Master Plan, and the reason for this is that there is outdated mech systems, also poor thermal performance. There's also some issues around, you know, what it might cost to be brought up to code. But even though Miles Lewis thinks this is probably one of the worst examples of a grounds building, you know, it is what it is. But it is also the building that is Wominjaka. It is the one that people come across on Grattan Street. It's the place where a lot of our students get their graduation photos. So while it may not be the coolest thing that we have, there's a certain significance about it. So what we were looking at in particular was to have a look at how we might start to assess buildings and how this might become part of an approach to adaptive reuse rather than just demolishing the projects. To the next one. So this was our case study, the initial drawings that were done, where we are now, and Luca will go into more of the specifics around the engineering. The issue that we had initially was looking for documentation, and this is something that you'll have a look at with your project as well. So a lot of the documentation that we retain and a lot of documentation that is retained is usually architectural documentation. For those who build things, we know that while architects, we like to sort of see our importance, but we need to know how the building stands up. We need to know what the engineering is. We need to know what changes were made during construction that leaves the building as where it is. And so in terms of the documentation, what information do we need to know so that when we get to a stage where we're looking at what is the future of a building, that we can make some really good assessments about that. I love this. So Xiao and I had gone to the Public Records Office because we had gone through the documentation we have online, and, you know, it was reasonably useful. It was some architectural drawings, there was some interiors of things that happened over time. So we've got a pretty good vibe of what was happening, but we had no idea who the engineer was. We could make assumptions about who was doing engineering for grounds in Scarborough, who were the architects for this project. But it wasn't until we found this at the Public Records Office And whoever was on duty that day heard Xiao and I squeal with like, who found out who these people are? And so then we rang Clive Steele, and they had thrown all the documents out during COVID because storage was expensive and it was physical documentation. And that's one of the problems that we have, is that a lot of documents aren't recorded because they're not architectural, but we can't really understand what a building is without sort of the complement of people who have contributed to the building. So this was an assessment of the limited documentation that we had. There were other assessments, particularly for the ARCOM paper, where we looked through how this sort of then aligns with different codes, and which is something that you will also talk about as well. So we found architectural drawings were fairly well represented, and so we could get some ideas about, you know, what the floor plans were, sections, elevations, the slab thickness, but in terms of what the building actually was made of, what happens when, I mean, we can see things, but it's what happens in the walls. And anyone who's worked on a renovation where you think the structure might be there, but it's until you start to remove some of those linings, you just go, oh, we have a problem. Or you know, that's not exactly what we thought of. The complexity is that while we're dealing with existing information, that's fine. But also where the trajectory from this is also looking at contemporary documentation. So what happens for contemporary buildings? And if we're expecting to be able to retrofit in 20, 30, 40 years' time, how do we ensure that the information that we retain now is available so that decisions can be made that are useful, rather than so, well, it's beyond its financial existence, so pull it down. So that becomes sort of a really sort of interesting way of, and particularly with the research that I've sort of gone my trajectory with, is what do we need to be able to understand our buildings, what needs to be retained? Because we thought this would be a fairly simple exercise, but we have no information. It's very limited, and so, you know, even the name of the engineer was something that was sort of a, you know, a public records, you know, it just happened to be there. So there needs to be some very sort of considered guidelines about how we start to record our buildings, so that not just for now, I mean, because we have an immediate problem now, but also what legacy are we leaving for people in the future? And now I'm going to hand over to Lupa, who is going to talk about the non-destructive part. Yes.
Okay. So maybe before going to the non-destructive testing component, when we were looking at the engineering perspective, my background is structural engineering. So when we look at the codes, how the codes are evaluation over the time, and
yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, that's fine. So we were looking at how the codes are evolved over time, because this building is constructed in 1969, 71 during that time. And especially the design requirements during that time, especially the structural design requirements, has changed a lot. So the design was done in 1971 based on the ASCA 2 1972-73 code requirements based on the working stress requirements. That's what we consider in the design. But with the AS3600 concrete code requirements, the recent code requirement, we design based on the limit state design. So there's a huge difference between how we design based on the earlier code and the new code as well. And also the reinforcement, we have seen the reinforcement grade that was used in 1973 is 230 MPa, whereas the recent steel we use 400 MPa reinforcement. So this is also a big difference that we have seen. If we renovate or refurbish our buildings, these things has to be considered in terms of the strength of the structural elements in the building. And the other two important aspects we have realized is the wind loading requirement and the earthquake loading requirement. So when you look at the 1971 wind load requirement is far more less compared to the 1170.2 wind requirements, the current code we have. And also the earthquake code requirement, we haven't had an earthquake code at that time. So that's a huge difference that if we consider our building, the seismic requirement has to be considered carefully as well. Because the design done in 1971 was based on the gravity loading. We haven't considered much of the lateral loads like wind or earthquake loads. So if we consider that for the recent code requirements, that doesn't comply. So that's one of the major findings we have identified through this study. And as Kirsten mentioned, we had a problem of identifying, what are the reinforcement requirements and all that, even though we had the calculations document, the structural engineering calculations document. Not all the calculations were there, even though it was a very, when we find out that we got the document, we were very happy, but when we were going through the document, not all the calculations were there. So we did some non-destructive testing using Schmidt hammer and the proformeter. So the Schmidt hammer we used to get the compressive strength of elements like columns, walls, and slabs. And also currently during that time, the building was occupied as well. We couldn't do all the elements, but we selected some elements in the building, and then we got the compressive strength of the elements. And then proformeter we used to measure the cover of the elements, and also we could get the diameter of the reinforcement bars. So that's how we got some of the information in this building when we did the non-destructive testing. So what we have found out is the strengths. I don't know whether you have seen the building, the outer layer of the building is all external walls are load-bearing walls. So we thought that could be precast concrete, but because it's not exposed, we don't know whether it's actually precast or not in situ, but we were assuming that it would be precast during that time as well. The compressive strengths are higher when we measure the compressive strength of the Schmidt hammer, saying that there is a potential for use, high compressive strength requirements in the columns. And then what we did, we had the initial finite element model using the given information in the calculations, document. And then we use whatever the information that we measured from the non-destructive testing, the compressive strength, reinforcement, and things like that. And then we updated the model and looked at the capacities. And as I said before, we have identified the reinforcement provided in the current building does not comply with the code requirements in the current AS3600 as per the code, especially because the grade is double that we are using currently. That's one of the reasons. And also, especially the seismic condition, we haven't designed for the ductility that we are, targeting with the current code requirements. Because the design at that time was done basically based on the gravity loading, as I said before, the vertical loads only, not much of a horizontal loads where we consider the ductility of the building. So those are some of the main things we have identified through this study. And yeah, if we need to go ahead, I think we need to do more testing of the building and get more information on that. That's pretty much, I think, I'm going to cover.
But I think one of the most interesting parts was, the information that is available. And I think, but also, I mean, this is something that you will then look at when you're doing those renovations about how, you know, where you start to move between codes and when do you start to trigger sort of having to sort of upgrade those things as well. Mm.
All right, that was great. So many questions, but I'll hold off along with everybody else until we get to the end. Hannah, I might hand over to you. You can stop sharing.
All right, so hello everyone, Hannah Kuek, Room Architecture, and I'm joined by our Director Jessie Judd from Architecture as well. So we're really happy to be here today, and we're currently working on the Baillieu Library refurbishment, which is a really exciting project, and we're currently on site in construction in the first phase of this work. So it's a really timely topic to discuss this, particularly as we're working in a mid-century building and really have gone through the processes of understanding its significance, why it's worth preserving, saving and giving a new life for the future life cycle of this building, not just looking at the next 5-10 years, but really looking quite far ahead into the future and the how of how we're able to get there along that journey. So to set the scene, there are many mid-century buildings on campus around this era, and they form part of the fabric of Parkville campus. So it's this patchwork of different buildings from different times, and they sort of form their own network of buildings. So here are a few as a snapshot. Many have been refurbished over time, some haven't been, and it's really interesting to analyse their value in terms of heritage, in terms of cultural significance, and then viability as well, thinking about structural constraints and the slabs, and also about the amenity and what those existing floor plates can offer us as well in terms of what those future programs might be for those different buildings. And here is a snapshot. One that we'll talk about at the end if we have time is the original Arts West building and the work that ARM did on the new Arts West building, and a bit around the discussion of whether the original brief was to retain and refurbish, and it was really about trying to upgrade the existing, and a new building, as you know, lives on campus now. So if we have time at the end, we'll talk a little bit about that process and how that came to be. So the Baillieu Library. The first step was really understanding the cultural and heritage significance of this building. It's not heritage listed, but we understand that it holds great heritage value on campus. And it's also really meaningful to a lot of people who have studied at University of Melbourne. It's iconic and it's known all around the world. It's also home to the Special Collections, which is the most incredible resource of, you know, Shakespeare's second collection, Blake and Goya artworks, and all of these incredible artefacts that all live within the building that everyone has access to at any given time. But a really big part of this project was creating the space to be able to protect and store these collections so that they were in a pristine
If you want to look at any of these things, you just ask.
You just ask. It's amazing, and our minds were blown as we've been able to explore lots of different collections items, and they've been really the starting point to inspire a lot of our design. But it's amazing, and if you aren't familiar with the Special Collections, we really encourage you to go and explore. It's amazing. You'll have gloves and you get to open them up on a pillow, and it's all very special. So go and have a look. So in the university's Shape Hill Campus survey, which I think is a couple of years old now, there was a survey done on all of the different buildings on campus to hear what the students really thought about these different spaces. And perhaps surprisingly or unsurprisingly, the Baillieu was the most commented on building on campus. But interestingly, it had in equal measure positive and negative criticism about the project. But it was a really polarising building. Everyone, all the students had interacted with it and they could identify some of the problems. It also holds a lot of, there's almost this romantic side of the Baillieu Library, and it holds a lot of memories. And this was a love letter from a student, an anonymous love letter to the Baillieu Library, which we thought was quite sweet. But it really tells you that it really is significant, not just from the fact that it's an interesting mid-century building. It actually holds a lot of memories and legacy on campus. So it's something that is worth preserving, but then it really presents the challenge of how do you actually upgrade and make this a contemporary leading learning space. So the building itself.
Let me ask us the question, is it a good building?
Yes.
And we were a bit torn because it's really problematic in a whole lot of different ways. As building quality is reasonably poor. But is it culturally important? Absolutely.
Yes.
And I think that's the difficulty with university buildings, particularly because there is sort of a culture and a legacy that's
right.
Yeah.
And you need to measure there are all of these different parts that you need to measure the viability of a building and its significance to be able to get these projects off the ground. But there are so many different factors that you have to consider holistically to be able to make that decision. It's very interesting. So the building itself is actually 4 different buildings joined together. So the first stage 1 in blue was constructed in 1959, followed by the green in 1969, and then the red in 1975. Each of these buildings have their own services operating systems, and they have different slab construction methods, all of it. So we're really working within 4 existing buildings with different age construction, and then all of these several refurbishments that have happened since, lots of interior fit outs. So our original engagement was to do really a hamburger stack of the Baillieu Library, and it was almost every second floor. So doing that preservation storage facility to protect the special collections, and then doing level 2, part of level 3 as well, and then these spaces in between. So because of that split scope, it meant we didn't trigger the planning of having to upgrade the whole entire building, but it also meant we're working underneath that 50%. But then how do you create a strategy so that we don't end up with this piecemeal ad hoc approach that we've seen in the several refurbishments since the original buildings? How do you create a strategy to be a good building custodian and actually upgrade the building in a staged and logical way, which is where we come to the master plan. So,
which was not part of our brief.
Not part of the brief.
Asked to do a renovation, and we kind of hit pause and said, no, to be a good building custodian, you need actually a 50-year vision for this building. It's good enough to keep. You need to work out how we're going to look after it for its next generation. Next generation. And
to do good and to go in and do something well once and then move on to the next, and not just be thinking about your particular stage in isolation, but future planning services strategies as well that can then be unrolled throughout the building. So there's been a lot of thinking, and we'll step through some of those key aspects. So it really began by setting out clear objectives, so going through a lot of briefing with the client and really understanding where the university is heading in the future and what this building is trying to achieve. So it's really about setting the scene for the next building life cycle. So as we said, not 5 years, but really thinking 20 years plus down the track, aligning with the university sustainability plan and the design standards as well. It's essential that there's consistency across campus. We're not looking at this project or this building in isolation. We have to think about the broader university goals, improving the student experience, celebrating scholarly practice, really important, intuitive wayfinding, displaying and showcasing the incredible special collections, wellbeing, diversity and inclusion, and then of course the cultural and heritage aspects as well. From there, I won't go through all of these in detail, but basically we broke down the different components of the master plan and then went into each in more detail. So the first was really to look at the zoning stack, and we understand often funding for these sorts of projects, they come in buckets. You might be lucky to get sort of 10 mil at a time. So we have to really think about how we're organising the building vertically so that there is this intuitive wayfinding and noise control, and that students can find their way in a logical sense, not just relying on signage. We also looked at a typical floor plates stack and trying to understand the good amenity and really optimising those views towards South Lawn and optimising natural light. So we're quite fixed with that facade. There's not a great deal that we can do. And then looking at the darker, as you move through to the centre of the floor plate, that naturally darker zone as well. And then trying to figure out where the special spaces go, where the student learning spaces go, and then where the circulation amenities, book stacks and store go as well. So trying to come up with a logic for that, and then also a ceiling strategy that we'll come to as well. Each floor then goes into a detailed floor plate zoning. So we've got the stack, we've got the strategy for a typical floor, and then each floor goes into the particular zoning and requirements of the brief, so that over the course of the building we're meeting all of the requirements and having the sorts of spaces that we need in this building, and also looking at special destination spaces that we're leading people to as well, which we'll touch on as we go along. A big part of this project is how to stage the project. So this idea of doing completed portions and grouping different floors together. So really thinking about how you can step your way through, complete one part, move on to the next, and the ones that go together in the most logical sense. So all of these mid-century buildings, they've got their own quirks and character, and there's also the original design intent of the architect that you want to honour and then build on. So some of the original design has been undone a little. A really big part of the original Baillieu Library design was about this compression and release, and this was articulated through voids in the building that open up into these incredible tall spaces that really they pour out views out to Southbourne, and they let in a lot of incredible natural light. So they're fantastic, and you can see those images up the top give you a snapshot. Unfortunately, over time, with fire requirements and all of the rest of it, they've all been enclosed quite inconsistently. You can see there's been this real mismatch of approaches to trying to meet that compliance. But you'll see that the effect of the void has sort of been lost in the building as it currently stands. So this is something we were interested in and wondering how we can try and replicate this idea in terms of a strategy. So if you think back to our typical floor plate plan and really trying to optimise those student spaces, the idea here is compression and release through a ceiling plane strategy. So the existing floor to floor is very low, they're 2.5, which is not contemporary standard. So in the green zones, we're looking at removing the ceiling and trying to really maximise as much space as we can, exposing the surfaces and trying to gain as much natural light as we can. And then through that yellow zone, having the compression, which is where you have that the existing ceiling, which is the mid-century grid, and that lower portion where we have those harder working spaces, the book stacks and the amenities and storage and so on.
So this is, I think, kind of key and interesting is trying to learn from the building and the building design rather than to replicate what the building design had in its mind in 1959. Most of that was lost. Most of that doesn't meet contemporary standards, but trying to think about what was the original building trying to do and how can we address that agenda in a forward-looking way.
That's right. And then the other part of it is celebrating the amazing original fabric that's there. So there are some really interesting components that we want to be able to reuse and restore. And part of this is the incredible mosaic tiles and stone. And then also elements, fixtures and fittings from the building, and also furniture as well. And then using, for example, the normal Redpath sculpture as a point of entry to design, so that we're really looking at what's there, drawing on it, retaining and reusing where we can, and then using it to inspire the next. Oh, excuse me. Lost our slides. So a part of this involved, there we go, a furniture audit of all of the existing furniture that's contained within the building. And what we've found is, there are some amazing things, Featherston Mixie chairs, and we're reusing over 1,000 items and then restoring them back to their original condition, reupholstering and then giving them the new life. And some of these have been from 1959, which is really incredible that when you invest in quality furniture, you could be sitting on the same chair that your grandmother sat on whilst she was studying for her exams, and there's something very cool about that. And then, as we touched on, so restoring and reusing where possible, and then taking those design cues and then embedding them through contemporary technologies to create these design responses that speak very closely to the special collections, and then also draw on heritage references as well as links to the modernist movement as well. So taking some of the geometry, some of the treatment of columns as well, so that we've got a contemporary response, but it's deeply embedded in respecting the history and original design intent of the building.
So this is about understanding the context of what others were doing at the same time as the building.
That's
the building doesn't offer us anything in that space. What would have happened?
Some of the benchmarks, yeah. And then coming up with a colour palette as well. So when we have feature spaces, rather than having this building that's got all these different things, different colours, different treatment, how do you come up with a consistent colour palette? And we discovered Le Corbusier's colour keyboard from 1959, which is a beautiful thing. And there's a website and you can do all your sliders and you can order the book as well, but it's a really beautiful thing. The other part is determining destination. So coming up with this strategy where not every space is going to be the wow, characterful moment. There needs to be a baseline strategy as well, where you come up with consistent finishes that will be unrolled throughout parts of the building, and then your special spaces, and really looking at a 70 to 30% split in that approach. And some of these finishes are shown here. So consistent flooring types, treatment to walls, treatment to ceilings that align with the university design standard. And then those accent finishes in those destination spaces as well, where everything will be based on the colour keyboard, using a special collections item for inspiration, and then using a more elevated and special type of finish in those zones.
Interestingly, John Buckingham, the curator of Baillieu, brought a whole of items out that were from 1959 from the collection. So he sort of curated a collection of things that for us to review that were from the building design.
Yeah.
Not connected to the building, but just contemporary at that time.
Yeah.
Quite nice.
It's really exciting.
John's a trouble.
He's an absolute troublemaker.
We love John. And another big part, we won't go into too much detail, it could be its whole own presentation, but about the types of informal learning settings and where students like to study and how they study best. So a big part of this was challenging the brief again, first by looking at a master plan, but also thinking about the services strategy. So in our original brief, it was just retain existing, patch and, Band-Aid fixes here and there. And you could do that, but you're going to have to do it all again in 10 years, 10 years. And we challenged that and we said, what are you really doing here? You walk around the library, students are falling asleep, the air quality in here is terrible. What are you going to do about it? So we worked with ADP to create a mechanical and HVAC strategy that introduced a new plant room on each floor and then would tap out a new, so each floor we would go into, you have a whole new system and then you stage upgrades as you go. Same with the fire strategy.
So converting a whole of building mix system to a floor by floor system
floor.
incrementally as we go.
That's right. So you can do each floor at a time and then gradually you work your way through the whole building. And then when you get to the end, you can return those original risers back to floor space as well. So there's a whole plan and strategy for that upgrade. Same with fire. So when you're doing a hamburger building, the building will eventually be fully sprinkled. But how do you create firewalls and compartments in the meantime, and how do you step your way through that? So that's been a challenging part as well, that coming up with a fire strategy that enables sprinkling to new areas and then creating the compartments to the existing zones as well. A lot has been done with heritage, but we thought we'd just touch on one example. This is the Lee Scott Room, which is the most intact heritage space in the building. And you can see it's got beautiful Japanese silk wallpaper, which is quite similar to the ones on these beautiful sliding panels at the front of your room. But you can see that over time it's become really damaged with water damage. So we worked closely with the University Heritage team and also with the Grimwade Centre as well to look at the value, the possibility of cleaning and retaining, fixing the leaks in the first instance. But can this be restored to its original state or not? And then unfortunately it couldn't be, so we're going to be replacing it with a like-for-like product. But then in these instances, the amount of documentation you need to go through in terms of preservation, what needs to be retained and kept, how to preserve the original design, but then how to also turn it into an amazing contemporary space as well. So it's been a really interesting process, and these types of heritage drawings we've done for different spaces within the building, so that everything is documented, things are kept, and they might be removed from a space and then restored and then reinstated, or they might be reinstated into another part of the building as well. So thinking about all of these really important components, you can see that incredible life being reinstalled there. These are some of the spaces. We thought we'd just end on a snapshot of where we end up. So if you remember that normal red path sculpture, looking at introducing, beautiful timber battens that take the elements of that sculpture and then create this incredible form. So every space you go into, also the carpet in this space is based on one of those 1950s design movement artworks that John recommended to us. So you can see that it is really deeply embedded. This is the entry to the reading room, and you can see again some of those original interior elements have been reinstalled as well. So looking at the really consistent timber framing and breakup, and then also trying to optimise student study spaces as well. You can see here reuse of the Mitzi chairs. This is an object-based learning lab. And here is one of the postgraduate study spaces, and you can see again the inclusion of the mosaics and some of the geometric forms from the modernist movement as well. So that takes us to the end of the value and some of the challenges and the way that we've stepped through. And if there's time, we could briefly talk about Arts West.
Spare a couple of minutes.
Couple of minutes.
I can do this in 2 minutes.
All right,
Just
let's
in
go.
the spirit of being contrarian, we should probably show you a moment where we didn't think it was appropriate to retain the building.
But I should introduce Jessie Judson, right? Hannah's right-hand man.
That's right.
Assistant. So this is Arts West before we got to it. For those of you who know the building now, we retained the basement and the lecture theatre underneath. So that's the part of the original building. We also retained the west wing of it, but removed what is now the north wing of it. North wing used to look a lot like Baillieu. And when we were commissioned for the project, we were looking very closely at Baillieu, which is just to the left of the red splotch there, and the abomination that was put on top of the Baillieu, which was not unlike the architecture school that used to be here with a little extension on top. So a really bad retrofit, must be said. This is what we found ourselves with: a very thin office building, a load-bearing facade. One that wasn't suitable for teaching and learning, and then one that would deliver us teaching and learning spaces with 2.3 ceilings. And that was going to require enormous structural services and architectural effort to attempt to convert a building with, was going to be a moderate outcome. And we looked long and hard at this as a scenario before we moved through it. Next slide shows us some of those studies. Here's a snapshot of those options, and the top left there in the kind of purpley colour shows the existing entombed Arts West building with a new annex put on top and on the north side of it, and then looking at the whole piece. But in the end, the option that stood out best was actually to bring it down and to retain only the north wing in grey and the ground floor and the lecture theatre that went underneath it, and provide quite a far more purposeful experience for teaching and learning that couldn't have been accommodated. The study of arts and humanities had not had a contemporary teaching and learning space that had been built in 50 years. So they didn't actually have facilities that were fit for purpose. So that was one of their biggest constraints to read the whole thing too, is did they have rooms like this in there? So to end, this is where we find ourselves on Professor's Walk now with Arts West, next to the Baillieu Library. We've just been talking about having replaced rather than retrofitted building. So I thought, it's always good to flip the coin sometimes and look at it from the other side as well.
I think absolutely. That's great.
Because otherwise you wouldn't have been able to walk through those rooms, 2.5 ceiling.
Brendan would have had a sore forehead.
You'd need a hard hat.
That's great. Thank you. That's really good presentation. So that's a good note to finish on, Jesse, because it isn't about retaining everything at all costs. Absolutely not. It's about going through a process to actually decide what's worth keeping and what you can make something out of.
Why keep it and what outcome? And do you have a better scenario as opposed to just demolishing for its own sake?
Yeah.
I
might launch into questions. Are there questions around the room? Is that your hand up?
That's my hand up. I have a question. So my question for ARM, known for being challenging the status quo and repetitive architecture, how do you, so in 30 years' time, when the Baillieu is going to be renovated, how do you ensure that your design intent is kept, and so that there is a logical set of documents that capture everything? Like, how do you, the 4 buildings that have been brought together, the story across not just the architectural intent but the whole building? What form will this be in, assuming that Autodesk may not exist in 20 years' time, or we won't be able to open those files in 3D anymore because, migration?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and we worked with the University Estate Planning team on this. So it's a master plan report document, and I think everything lives on Luna now, but I guess it's essentially a PDF document, and you would hope that should we be lucky enough to get the next stage, we would return to that document and continue through. But I think the idea is that you could give it to another architect and they would be able to continue on the process with that framework as a guide.
We were pretty adamant about this master plan document for the building that was beyond our piece of work, and got support from Dean Boothroyd and Alan Perb to get it done, to recognise the importance. And it wasn't because we wanted to do the whole building, but we knew the building had a series of really bad renovations and they hadn't done the building justice, and we didn't want to add another one. Whatever ARM we're into in 2026, let's plonk it in there. Somehow wanted to put a stop to that accretion. You ask a really interesting question: how do you preserve things and not? Especially now that documents have become enormous, we have almost the opposite problem that we had in the 70s. Now you could probably lay the whole documentation set, if you with the gaps there, on the table and be pretty relaxed. Now we run into many thousands of pages. I reckon a contemporary set of documentation different is 3,000 pages. Information overload. And some's going to get lost, and you're going to end up with junk information, partial information, unconnected information, wrong versions of information, superseded information, all of the things. And a what do you call it? A point cloud model. What the hell is that? And are we going to be able to open it? All of those things. So it is somehow perplexing. And there's this sort of, we're contracted to provide as-built on all of our projects. I don't even know what that is in that context too, to be perfectly honest. But once you have to draw every inch that's actually all the decisions that have been made.
But also the other thing I find interesting, is this a novated contract? So you don't actually hold the documents. So it's whoever is looking after those documents, because I'm thinking of historians of the future. So because this is one of the things I find is sort of, in the past it was, the architect would usually hold on to this information, but now with contemporary procurement methods, this could be an architect or an engineer, which is fine because they have to hold these things for at least 7 to 10 years. But if it's a building or project
share
manager,
a little bit of trivia. We've been in practice for almost 40 years. We have offsite storage. That offsite storage has 2,000 boxes in it and almost 1,000 tubes. No idea how we're ever going to get through this stuff. Most of it's junk, but I'm too scared to get rid of it.
But I think that's also one of the interesting things that happens with. That's the thing with history. And then what happens when it's the firm gets sold to somebody else in the future? We're looking at Greg Burgess archives, and we're basically throwing his models in a skip now because we have no way of recording those things.
We need to replace the carpet at Hamerhall. And the carpet had kind of been there for 30 years and endless champagne poured on it and God knows what. That was looking pretty grey and horrible. And yet we were convinced that John Truscott had actually put some pretty fabulous carpet in there. We found the original carpet sample in his old studio in the UK. So that was a bit of, amazing discovery. It's the original sample, which indeed was bright and beautiful and gave us strength through the heritage architects to replace it with the bright, beautiful carpet that's there now. So it is interesting, the power of the archive.
I'll stop talking.
I'll just dive in quickly on the question of who keeps the documents. Surely that's a client thing, isn't it? Because the client's maintaining the building and upgrading mechanical
But
services.
what if it's a
and-
developer?
So,
I mean, what if it's a developer and they're selling it off? I mean, the university isn't, but you know,
whoever's charged with maintaining that building and keeping the services up to date and all the rest of it, you know, they've got a vested interest in that being a live set of documents that they refer to on a monthly, basis. I would
I
have
think
thought.
it should live in the building.
yeah.
We should live in the building.
In the building.
I think we should carve the hieroglyphics into the foundation
No,
stone. so that-
there should be in the fire control and the plan and whatever, a set of printed documents that live in that actual building. It's,
Because I know that Denise will have an opinion about this. Denise's PhD is looking at strata and the difficulties of, how do you basically get solar panels onto an apartment building? And and where that information comes from.
Challenges.
It's a challenging.
the reason I say it should live in the building is because that's where we discover them the best. Like we're always looking, whenever we start a new project, when you discover them, the best stuff is in there.
Are there other questions around the table? Yeah. Nick, is that, yeah.
Hi, I'm Vic, and thanks for that presentation. It was really interesting, and I was just wondering regarding structural aspect and some of the reasons that they have given. The lateral loads not being up to date wasn't even part of the reason, right? Whereas the reasons were mostly like mechanical services and things like that. But whereas if the structural aspect is somewhat, if it could stand up to now, can you do some kind of, let's say, modeling to say that, okay, with the next 50 years, considering the lateral loads and whether it can be slightly modified, maybe, and also thinking of like maybe slight demolition, like what Jesse was saying with some of the things I was thinking, okay, can there be some slight demolition and maybe improvement structurally? So that,
Yes.
Yeah, of course. Say for example, if some of the elements are not, compliance with the color requirements, we can do some strengthening. For example, say the column is not sufficient for the, the loading. Maybe we can have some strengthening of the column. Maybe we can put some. There are new techniques available as well. Say for example, if we fiber reinforced concrete, we can apply fiber reinforced concrete or something like that. We can do, of course, to strengthen the elements. So if there is a, reduction of the capacity, there are some techniques.
I think the biggest challenge happens in change of use. So if you have the same building use continuing, then it doesn't trigger all of those compliances. But the minute you change use, convert an office building into a residential building.
Toilets become a problem. Yeah.
Everything becomes a problem. Fire rating, seismic load. So it's that, under our current building codes, which, we're all are ruled by, that's the biggest trigger. And, architects are constantly grabbing up on, we should turn this sewing factory into a cathedral. That's going to open up this Pandora's box of stuff.
That's something else I wanted to touch on quickly, because in your paper, you start by talking about performance-based design being the core of the NCC, really. And I believe that, the yellow books and all of the codes and guidelines are there to protect your, if you do that, then it's difficult to get sued because that's what everybody else is doing, and that's the basis of getting sued. If you can demonstrate you've done what the equivalent architect or engineer would have done, you're okay. But so if it's had the same use and it's been there for 50 years, happily doing all that something, it's hard to argue that all of a sudden it's not up to scratch. And there are, I know in structural engineering there are codes and methods to actually justify based on putting loads onto structure that you don't know what's in there and you don't know how it works. But if you can demonstrate that it's got enough of a factor of safety, looking at the deflections, underimposed loadings of 101 jerrycans of water weighing it down, you can actually justify it and prove that it's okay. So I think retrofit, when we decide we want to keep a building, and that's that important first step, I think that there's lots and lots of ways that we need to get our mind around that needs to become more mainstream in doing it. One of the issues I think is everybody likes to do what they've done before. So, you know, to actually prove a building that way takes a lot of effort because we're not used to doing that.
Yeah. I work in John Medley, and every morning I catch the lift and it says it's a warning about the asbestos. And I've also been told by the dean that the building is very sick and that it's past its life. Does that seem to be the case on the basis of your analysis?
That's something that we didn't get into. But one of the things, as we've sort of unfolded, people did some interesting things, and this is something that we were looking at. What was the building colour that was demolished?
One of the university building was recently demolished. Sorry, my memory now.
Yeah, I'm just going my brain.
But exactly, the building was quite strong in terms of structure. It has
The Brown
spaces.
Library, for instance?
No, it was
Oh, near the medical building.
yeah, the new sorry.
Yeah.
The main issue that we found, the reasons why they needed to demolish was exactly asbestos. And they found asbestos everywhere in the protection of the steel components to connect the prefab elements on the balconies to the structure. And there were so many, it was almost impossible to remove them. That make any solutions to reuse the building for the purpose as this educational one completely unviable. And I was just so shocked when I see that building be demolished within our university. That was, with some concern.
We just left the Baillieu site meeting, and I reckon half the meeting was talking about asbestos remediation.
Yeah.
So it's a key consideration, and you've got to decide that this building really is worthy because it's a long, difficult, expensive, dangerous path.
And it is dangerous, and you don't, in terms of budget, which is something we haven't really even spoken about, if you might end up spending the same or more
And not get the optimal outcome.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the examples with the A&P building that was at Circular Quay, where during the construction process, rather than just using asbestos as fire separation, someone we can put asbestos dust into the mortar, and this will never catch on fire.
Oops.
Until you want to renovate that building in the future. But I think, and this is where it comes down to documentation, knowing where asbestos was used, and if there was some description of.
You'll never know. Everywhere, you've got to assume.
Just hold that thought for a moment, because it's 1 minute to 5, I think, or even later. So it's 5 o'clock. Just so people online can go, and actually people here can leave as well. I'll just quickly talk about what's on around the traps, and it's only a single slide, so that's useful. And it's really just a quick update on the Housing Commission towers. So as you know, the court actually heard a challenge from Inner Melbourne City Legal, which was successful. So the legal case went back to the High Court and resumed on the 10th of June, I think, and is continuing. And in the meantime, the Court of Appeal have granted an injunction preventing eviction notices to residents, which is pretty interesting. So it's a long saga, and it's becoming longer and more messy as it goes on. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the conversation, but to keep it moving again, Jessie and Hannah, are there strategies around asbestos which are containment where you can just not go near it, or is it just?
It's a bit of a serious issue in our office. Our founding directors died from asbestos.
Yes, of course.
And so we say no, get rid of it.
Get rid of it.
There's no excuse.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair enough.
If you demolish a building, though, don't you? That's really difficult, isn't it? Getting rid of the asbestos.
So we get rid of it
Don't
safely.
give it a problem.
But never entomb it, never put a sticker on it saying, don't do anything, this building's got asbestos. Like, if we're doing work on it, it's all. Because it just, it's a big mistake, it's going to be costly, we all made it, and we all have to
Yeah,
So I want to bring back to the point of information. So my PhD was about information management in energy retrofitting, and like one of the key things from information is that probably getting no information, you get so much information that it becomes useless. Especially if you start considering different aspects of architecture, then you have energy and carbon and LCA, and that adds other information. And then you have to collaborate with consultants, like you collaborate with ADP. So a key thing in consultation with ESD consultants came that you need a retrofit information manager in between as a specialty to actually manage this whole information. Is something like that adopted in reality in the new projects, or like how does that?
I think about the process that we've experienced, and I think, I mean, I would love to have someone like that on board. I think it could be part of the project management. I think we were just given, they were like, hi everyone, here's the login to Luna, off you go, happy hunting. And it was access to the database of every drawing, every piece of documentation on every building, on every campus from the University of Melbourne. And it really was a matter of, hold on, what? And having to dig through, sift through, and emailing the project manager and saying, actually, we're just after these specific drawings, and things are kind of mislabeled, or it's very difficult to search for what you're looking for. So something like that would be amazing, a really fantastic asset, even to just give a breakdown. If I think there is a lot on Luna, and we were able to find some really helpful documents, but if someone could go in and just create a summary of what's there and where to go, what they're called, and then it's really clear what needs to be explored further and what we need in addition. So there's kind of a combination of that, and then doing a lot of site verification and inspection, popping ceiling tiles and trying to see as much as we can. But something like that would be amazing, I guess.
I mean, we're in the lucky part of times for innovation.
Yeah.
Point cloud modelling,
Yeah.
X-raying slabs. You know, you can find out an awful lot
That's right.
about a building before you start breaking things up. And we're finding out a lot more once you start breaking
And that's
things
the
down.
thing, and not everything that's documented is what they're finding on site. Things that have said that we've found, remnant staircases and all sorts of things on site.
Beams are bigger than we thought they were, so
Yeah,
therefore the
beams are
fire pipe
deeper.
doesn't fit anymore.
That's right. So all sorts of coordination. So you can learn a lot from the existing documentation and material, but then there's when you are dealing with buildings of this age, a big part is you really need to go and start investigating as well. And it's fantastic that you could do preliminary examination of the slab and start to figure out the viability in that sense. But then you really need to go and open up and have a good look as well to see what you're actually working with.
can I ask a bit more about the early process on that? Because it is about that decision of, do we keep it or do we not keep it? And retrofit is expensive, but actually knocking down and rebuilding is expensive as well, right? And I'm interested. One of the interests Kirsten and I've been talking about, what is the comparison in full documentation costs 10% of the whole building compared to go in and actually X-ray slabs and do investigation, and kind of be interesting to see where that balance is. But I was really surprised to hear that Baillieu wasn't actually heritage listed. I assumed that's why someone went to all of that effort. So what was that early process like? Who drove the
Not many university buildings around the country are.
They're
Because it
of
hasn't-
significance.
They're of heritage
but not
significance,
not
but
listed.
it hasn't been
formal
their
listed?
ownership model, the domain management, all of that has meant that they haven't fallen to that pathway. It was interesting, the comments about, not ground's best building. I don't think the Baillieu's a very good building. The curtain wall's not very good. It's actually 3 different curtain walls. Go and have a look at it. Some of it's not built well.
They had a low budget from the beginning.
It was
The
a really
glazing
poor budget.
system is
It
not
wasn't
real.
finished well. It's been ruined so many times. This building is not worth the bottle.
So what was the
Except everyone's in love with it because of South Lawn. We all went there and we studied there, and it's got this presence
It's got
and
that legacy.
all of that.
Yeah.
So the story's big.
But I think that's also the thing. I mean, there's architecture that's great architecture, but then there's also the buildings that are part of our lives. And so that's also the fabric of our city. And so you know, it's also, you know, we think of the city of Melbourne and, you know, having our parks and all of those types of things that were sort of planned as part of, you know, the lungs of the city. But now we've got a thing where we're just handing things over to developers where it's like, well, there's not, their gig isn't about, you know, giving back to the community. It is about, well, how much money do I make per square metre? And so, you know, it is, I think there's a challenge about how we think of our buildings. So it's not just, you know, is it beautiful, or you know, but also, you know, what does it actually mean to us as well?
I mean, the provocation for Medley is now that you know a lot more about the structure and a bit more about the services. Could it work operationally?
Yeah.
Could it function?
And how do we do it?
Is it too thin? Is the floors too skinny? Is there enough daylight? Can we get the lifts actually moving people thinking? Could you actually get a workplace that is how people want to work these days?
Rather than.
But also, what's an appropriate use of that building too? I mean, could it be, you know, student studio spaces or other things that don't
Student
require?
accommodation.
And that's why I'm interested in the Baillieu process, because it is about that process. They're leaving the emotion aside for a bit. I mean, was there a formal process for that, or was it more that they just started off with let's patch and do a minimal job and it just expanded a bit?
Before we came on board, it would be really interesting, I think, to hear from the estate's planning team on this, and Georgie Ma, her team, they worked, I think it was 3 years in the making, developing the brief for this project. So they had looked at lots of different options for it. And then by the time we got on board, they'd already been through this really detailed process. When we did get on board, we asked those questions straight up after we were able to look at some of the existing documentation, be able to do detailed site analysis and some preliminary, you know, do the 3D point cloud, pop a few ceiling tiles, see what we're working with. We did ask the question.
Are you sure?
Are you sure? Like, are you sure this is what you want to do? Yeah. So, and it was the thing that we were asked to do. And then it was really, okay, well, if we're going to do it, how do we create a pathway that's logical that will enable us to be good building custodians, which is where the master plan was born. But I think when we started, it had been through a really lengthy process already. I think we're talking about it in 2018 or something. We presented this at TEFMA and Georgie spoke about the process, but she was involved from the beginning and spoke about how it was conceived and all of the discussions around it.
I mean, that sounds like a good process, 3 years looking into what the pros and cons are, but I get the feeling on a lot of projects I worked on when I was in the industry that it was a high level executive decision made by one person in some organisation off probably only a part story of all of the information.
Yeah, sometimes you don't have all the information from the beginning.
I think as an industry, that's something we need to do a lot better.
Yes,
and as a building owner.
Hannah asked me how long it took us to make that decision on Arts West. And I was trying to think through that. I should go look at the dates, I could probably, but I think it probably was only 3 or 4 months, and it did require a sort of VC, you know, big man kind of moment.
That's right.
I recall. However, there was a lot of fast-paced option here. What does it mean? How important is this building? What can we do? What's the consequences of retaining it? All of those.
Yeah.
Because you can spend more money and more carbon and more time and angst to save something
and
then
not
a
get
poor
an
result.
optimal outcome. And I think if we want to, peek down the road, RMIT spent a lot on the new student precinct, new academic street, they call it, and they're not very happy having done that. It's not generated what they hoped it would do, which is opening the campus to Swanson Street, because that building fundamentally is unable to be open to Swanson Street because of its nature. So maybe that, quite a lot of money they spent on that wasn't the wisest investment.
So the other thing I've noticed about retrofit is quite often it's an all or nothing decision, and so it's nice to see bits where you keep, the north wing of Arts West, where you keep a little bit of this, and you keep the bits that are interesting. So the Union Building's a good example of that, where that was the first natural history museum in Australia, 1880 or something like that. So there's some serious heritage in there.
But this is the thing I find astounding with this campus. We have had some of the most amazing buildings, and we're just like, rip them down.
And there's hybrid options there where you could keep the really interesting bits, knock down 50% to 2/3 of the rest of the site and build your new building there. There's a really nice access north-south through there for for the campus, and it was originally slated to be a lab building, so the new building saw the highly sensitive vibration functions, and the old buildings, some of the offices and that sort of thing that aren't so sensitive. With some clever engineering and architecture, you can come up with really nice solutions to save some of these buildings.
I'm just really curious. This is obviously not the first time that the library is getting renovated, I'm assuming. So were there any lessons learned? Because this university does there's so much of funding and research going on in terms of emissions and embodied emissions, and energy and cost. So it's interesting how there has been multiple renovations. So are we going to continue doing this? Maybe after 15 years again, are we going to do the same process?
Look, we can get into quite a deep conversation about what a library is and what it has been for the last 70 years. I mean, if we look at people in the library now, I think we discovered it was only 3% of users actually had a book on their desk.
But they like being surrounded.
They love books,
by
but no one wants to use them.
to be part of the knowledge.
So that's a really interesting question about what libraries are used for. Think about technology 10 years ago, 20 years ago, computers, microfiches, all sorts of other stuff that was in and around libraries which no longer exist. So there's something very interesting about the purpose and so I expect it will change drastically.
Yeah, and there is just on that. So when we came to this project, in the beginning, there was a huge amount of benchmarking that was done and a lot of research to be able to validate the recommendations that were being made, also the types of learning spaces, and looking at, the recently completed ERC library and other projects around campus, looking at things like student feedback surveys and really understanding the types of spaces that students love, the spaces that they don't love, and then looking at international benchmarking as well to really understand what these contemporary spaces look like and to develop a strategy for what are we doing with the books and how are we designing all of these things, and then also leaning on the university design standards as well. So I think that's a living document that it doesn't yet have its chapter for everything, but I think the idea is that document will start to develop a bit more consistency across campus, or to make sure that the lessons that have been learned are being captured in there. So if there are preferred, we can't be specifying different toilet pans for every project on campus, things like that, to develop a bit of consistency and to also catch lessons learned where things have gone wrong, make sure it doesn't happen again, or things that are amazing, by the same token, make sure that they're included again. And for servicing and operations, there are, maintenance team requirements and all sorts of things to develop that palette. So certainly we have taken on lessons learned from other projects around campus, and then also, benchmarking exercises as well.
I'm just going to touch on a couple of comments online. Normally I've got Enzo here monitoring comments, but I missed them, unfortunately. One from Hannah Louie, who is a professor here. The university also has a vested interest sometimes not to divest documents, as is happening now in the case of the Medley Building. So I was interested in your comment, Jesse, about not many university buildings are actually listed buildings, and that's definitely the case here. We did retrofit studios, and we looked at all of the buildings around campus, and very few of them people have gone to the effort to actually list them.
Experience at Monash too, and contemplating some interesting buildings there and why they're not from the heritage.
So the question I have is, and I'd be interested in anybody's opinion on this, is because heritage is great in that it protects a building, but it also provides a lot of constraints. So all of a sudden, if you need to open up a facade to bring light in, you can't do it anymore, and that sort of thing. So
and you end up with a very low ceiling. And
so is heritage listing a good thing, or is it a bad thing? Or
it's probably an interesting question in a university context, because on the whole, universities are good custodians of buildings. They look after them, they last longer. On the whole.
I wouldn't say that on John Medley in any respect. Sorry.
Let's compare it to non-registered buildings in the rest of the place. If a building has no registration, there's nothing to stop it coming in. At least there's a debate like this in this place, at the very minimum.
Yeah, but we have no power in that
I know,
debate,
sorry,
so
I'm not trying to get political. But
So-
But it is political.
Of course.
It's totally
Everything is very
political.
political.
Everything
But on the
is.
whole,
True.
if you look across, on the whole, universities are better custodians of buildings than a lot of other institutions. I'm talking globally. And so the need for heritage registration is perhaps lesser, question mark. And if you want to get buildings heritage list, they can be, and that can be imposed on any owner.
Yeah.
It can be.
It's,
So that's
it's
a
an
problem.
interesting one because La Trobe is in a similar situation where they have there's a master plan that was done. But now they're starting to get other buildings in that are not part of that, and I'm not picking on any particular architectural practice, not ARM.
Oh, yeah.
They start with L, end with S. And
Load of shit, did you say?
Yeah. I would never say that.
But it's interesting because there's some really, traditionally heritage registered buildings that you would expect. I would say Old Arts doesn't have a heritage registration here.
oh, it does. It really does. I have looked at this. Yes, it does.
You reckon it's on the National Heritage
Absolutely.
Register?
We can't
Absolutely.
hang a hook, that.
No, it is.
It's on the National Heritage
There are a
Register.
number of them. If you look, yeah.
Okay, I'll look. Yeah.
No,
It's still a traditional sandstone, which is
that's the thing.
what is valued, and it's still in that
Old-fashioned,
absolutely
Gothic.
that part of the
Fits in
heritage.
with the way they market universities, rather than anything beyond
It's once you move into that
1900 or something.
modern period,
Yeah.
then it's
Considered worthless.
yeah.
I mean, John Medley's just been run to the ground. No one has looked after John Medley ever. So, this idea that universities are good custodians,
Chris.
no.
Chris,
You tried.
that's really interesting because John Medley has had a fortune spent on it.
Right,
So
well,
it's
wow.
been way
So how do you rate?
Wow.
I'm going to get controversial here. How do you rate John Medley compared to the old architecture building?
Oh, that's
The old
Architecture
architecture, the one
building that used to sit on this side.
they demolished.
Yeah.
It's probably better maintained than the old architecture building. I mean, you walk through John Medley, you just don't think, the interventions are just terrible. Two holes in the ceiling, pull them up, goes, it's horrible what they've done to John Medley.
I'm the same with the old architecture building. One of Melbourne's most revered architects, Peter McIntyre, put an abomination on the roof of the old architecture building. It was awful. So it's kind of an interesting debate, this sort of thing. It's what we value and how we value it and how we retain.
But also who's making decisions and why.
Yeah.
And which is at the crux of this, and that's why it is so controversial and political, because there's a whole lot of other agendas at play. And
Raymond Priestley, they're going to demolish Raymond Priestley.
Yeah.
Just anything after sandstone is just considered rubbish.
Community building locked up with no agenda at the moment.
Okay, Hannah's just made a note here that they cover a lot of that in her book, Adapt, which we covered a session or two ago
Oh, fantastic.
in the forum.
It's called Adapt.
Not Adapt, Brendan, the older one on Australian University
Oh, sorry, the older one, is it?
Yeah,
Okay.
with the ARC project, Philip and a number of us worked on the history of Australian university campuses that has chapters on heritage and conservation, but also a survey of all the history of all the building types across Australia, chapter on libraries, lecture halls, to get that comparative sense of working out what is significant in the 20th century.
Yeah.
Anna,
Okay.
could you share a link, please? Would love to read it.
Sorry about that. Never assume. Okay, and there's another comment there from Baillieu Library, just talking about how technology is coming on in leaps and bounds, and we can actually pull a lot of metadata out of PDFs these days. And I think hearing you talk about these thousands and thousands of bits of information, that's a job for AI, isn't it? Training something to go in and actually picking up all of this stuff. So
As long as you can open it in 20, 30 years time. Because part of my research is looking at how do we open old files? We can open files from the 90s, early Adobe, but it's often corrupt, and it depends on how we save it. One of the things I find astounding is some of our most important information is how do our buildings work? We put into the most fragile structures, which is digital archives.
Yep.
So, anyway, it's my thing.
One very last small question. Did I hear you right to say that it's 2.5 metres floor to floor, the John Medley? Not John Medley.
The value, yeah.
That is not floor
No,
to ceiling.
Floor to
Floor to
ceiling,
ceiling.
floor
Okay, I
to
was gonna
ceiling,
say,
not floor to floor. We
yeah,
gain a bit of extra, but floor to ceiling.
Floor to ceiling.
Yeah,
That's
and
good.
2.4 in
you,
some
Brent.
locations too.
Right.
Very deep beams and some difficult things to navigate.
Yeah.
Yeah, floor to ceiling, yeah.
Okay. All right, that's been a fascinating discussion. Which is really just the start of what to talk about in retrofit, which is good. So means we should have many more of these sessions.
I want to come back and talk about a project we're doing, converting a bus station into a musical.
A bus station and a musical.
That's great.
I love retrofitting performance venues into old things because it's the reverberation is totally different with each one. So it just makes it a unique experience. And that's the other side of the equation, isn't there is a lot of value to keeping parts of the building because it makes a better the best architectural outcomes, as far as I understand as a structural engineer, are the ones with the greatest constraints on them because that's where good design comes from. You need to design and come up with something that works. Okay, let's thank Kirsten and Nilipa and Hannah and Jessie. And we'll see you again in July. We have last Tuesday of each month. Thanks very much.
Cool. Thank you.
Just suddenly got recognised you. It's like the.
I've got less hair on my face.
A lot less hair on your face, yeah. Iteration of you, a couple of years ago.